as more tech startups stay private, so does the money. Not long ago, if you were a young, brash technologist with a world conquering startup idea, there was a good chance you spent much of your waking life working towards a single business milestone, taking your company public. Though luminaries of the tech industry have always expressed skepticism and even hostility toward the finance industry, tech's dirty secret was that it looked to Wall Street and the ritual of a public offering for affirmation, not to mention wealth. But something strange has happened in the last couple of years. The initial public offering of stock has become déclassé, déclassé, déclassé for startup entrepreneurs and their employees across Silicon Valley. And initial public offering is no longer a main goal. Instead, many founders talk about going public as a necessary evil to be postponed as long as possible because it comes with more problems than benefits. If you can get 200 million from private sources, then I don't want my company under the scrutiny of the unwashed masses who don't understand my businesses, said Daniel Amoril, the chief executive of Mattermark, a startup that organizes and sells information about the startup market. That's actually terrifying to me. Silicon Valley suddened the state for the IPO, rooted in the part in the Wall Street skepticism of new tech stocks, maybe the single most important psychological shift underlying the current tech boom. Staying private affords startup executives the luxury of not worrying what consider things that helps them avoid the quarterly earning treadmill. It also means Wall Street is doing what it failed to do in the last tech boom, using traditional metrics like growth and profitability to price companies. Investors have been tough on Twitter, for example, because its growth has slowed. They have been tough on Box, the cloud storage company that went public last year, because it remains unprofitable, and the e-commerce company Zulily, which went public last year, was likewise punished when it cut its guidance for future sales. Scott Cooper, the managing partner at the venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, and his colleagues said in a recent report that despite all the attention startups have received in the past in recent years, tech stocks are not seeing unusually high valuations. In fact, their share of the overall market has remained stable for 14 years and far off the peak of the late 1990s. That unwillingness to cut much slack to young tech companies limits risk for regular investors in the bubble pops, the unwashed masses. If that's what we are, aren't us likely to get washed out? Private investors, on the other hand, are making big bets on so-called unicorns, the Silicon Valley Jordan for startup companies valued at more than $1 billion. If many of those unicorn flop, most Americans will escape unharmed because losses will become confined to venture capitalists and hedge funds that have begun to buy into tech startups as well as tech founders and their employees. The reluctance and sometimes inability to go public is spurring the unicorns. By relying on private investors for a longer period of time, startups get more runaway to figure out sustainable business models to delay their entrance into the public markets. Firms like Airbnb, Dropbox, Palantir, Pinterest, Uber, and several other large startups are raising hundreds of millions and in some cases billions that they would otherwise have gained through an initial public offering. These companies are going public just in the private market. Dan Levitan, the manager partner of the venture capital firm Maveron, told me recently. He meant that in many cases, hedge funds and other global investors that would have bought shares in these firms other than IPO are deciding to go into late stage private funds. There is even an oxymoronic term in the act of obtaining private money in place of public offering is called a private IPO. In delay of IPOs has altered how some ventures capital firms do businesses. Rather than waiting for an initial offering, Maveron, for instance, says it now sells its stake and startup to order large private investors once it has made about 100 times its initial investment. It is the sort of return that once was only possible after an IPO. But there is also a downside to the new aversion to initial offerings. When the unicorns do eventually go public and begin to soar, or whatever it is, the fantastical horned beasts tend to do when they're healthy. The biggest winners will be the private investors that are now bearing most of the risk. It used to be that public investors who got in the ground floor of an initial offering could earn historical gains. If you invested 1,000 in Amazon at its IPO in 1997, you would have now have nearly 250,000. If you had invested 1,000 in Microsoft in 1986, you would have closer to 500,000. Public investors today are unlikely to get anywhere near such gains from tech IPOs, but by the time tech companies come to the market, the biggest gains have already been extracted by private backers. Just 53 technology companies went public in 2014, which is around the median since 1980, but far fewer than during the boom of the late 1990s and 2000, when hundreds of tech companies went public annually, according to statistics maintained by Jay Ruder, a professor of finance at the University of Florida. Today's companies are also waiting longer. In 2014, the typical tech company hitting the markets was 11 years old, compared with a median age of 7 years of tech IPOs since 1980. Over the last few weeks, I've asked several founders and investors why they are waiting. Few were willing to speak on the record about their own companies, but their answer will amount to what's the point? Initial public offering were also ways to compensate employees and founders who owned a lot of stock, but there are now novel mechanisms such as selling shares on a secondary market for insiders to cash in on some of their shares in private companies. Still, some observers cautioned on that the new trend may be a bad deal for employees who aren't given much information about the company's performance. One thing employees may be confused about is when companies tell them we are basically doing the private IPO. It might be it might make them feel like there is less risk than there really is, said Mr. Morrell of Mattermark. But she said it was hard to persuade people that their paper gains may never materialize. The Kool-Aid is really strong, she said. If the delay in IPOs become a normal condition for Silicon Valley, some observers say tech companies may need to consider new forms of compensation for workers. We probably need to fundamentally rethink how private companies compensate employees, because that's going to be an issue, said Mr. Cooper of Andreessen Horowitz. During a recent presentation for Andreessen Horowitz Limited Partners, the institution that give money to the venture firm, like Mark Andreessen, the firm's co-founder, told the journalist Dan Primark that he had never seen a sharper divergence in how investors treat public and private company chief executives. They tell the public CEO, give us the money back this quarter, and they tell the private CEO, no problem, go for 10 years, Mr. Anderson said. At some point, this tension will be resolved. Private valuation will not forever be higher than public valuations, said Mr. Levitan of Maveron. So the question is, will private markets capitulate and go down, or will public markets go up? If the private investors are wrong, employees, founders, and a lot of hedge funds could be in for a reckoning. But If they're right, it will be you and me wearing the frown, the public investors who missed out on the next big thing.